We won't do arts and literature in one session, but let's start. We'll finish the Alcotts and be halfway through. Hannah Adams was a contemporary and a distant cousin of President John Adams. Hannah was the first woman in the United States to earn a living by writing. Her major work at age 29 was called, they liked their titles long back then, An Alphabetical Compendium of the Various Sects Which Have Appeared from the Beginning of the Christian Era to the Present Day, later republished as A Dictionary of All Religions. Unlike writers who preceded her, Hannah's goal was that a member of any religion in her book could read her description and say, yes, that is what I believe. You can still buy the book today on Amazon. The first edition sold out, but her agent got all the profits. Hannah got a new publisher, and she lobbied for the United States' first copyright law, passed 5 years later in 1790. William Austin was the author of the Peter Rugg stories, very popular in his time. Peter Rugg was a cross between Rip Van Winkle and the Flying Dutchman. He disappeared during a New England thunderstorm and was later seen in far-flung times and places. Just as interesting, Austin was the Unitarian chaplain aboard the USS Constitution. That was one of the 3 original frigates that John Adams had built to start the U.S. Navy in 1794. It did well in the War of 1812, receiving the nickname Old Ironsides after bouncing some enemy cannonballs. The ship is still commissioned. After several restorations, it has been a museum ship for over 100 years. I've been aboard myself as a tourist in Boston, and I recommend the experience. Amos Bronson Alcott, Bronson to his friends, is the closest thing I've seen to a real-life Don Quixote. Born before 1800, Bronson was an environmentalist and a vegan. He worked as a teacher, but always failed because his experimental methods were unpopular. Parents complained that he had pupils writing their own stories instead of copying old stories by rote, and that he refused to beat their children. His book, Conversations with Children on the Gospels, was called, quote, Flippant and Offhand Conversation, and it got him called, quote, either insane or half-witted, unquote. Despite strong support from a few rich progressives, he took and lost 7 teaching jobs in a row. His last try ended when he admitted a black student and refused to expel him when other parents protested. At that point, he moved to Concord, where rents were cheaper. He tried to scratch a living as a writer with the help of his friend, a fellow member of the Transcendentalist Club, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Waldo to his friends. Bronson was a good talker, but a poor writer, even when helped by Waldo. In fact, he was never a good provider, and the family never had enough money until his daughter, Louisa May Alcott, became a best-selling author. There's a note in the archives from Louisa to her banker, please give my pa $5. Someone has crossed out 5 and written in 10. We don't know if he got away with it. His books on his educational methods did win some admirers around the world. In 1843, he went hopefully to England and came back with an admirer named Charles Lane. Charles purchased a farm in Harvard, Massachusetts, so that he and Bronson could set up a utopian community. As Alcott put it, we have made an arrangement with the proprietor of an estate of about 100 acres, which liberates this tract from human ownership, unquote. Lane paid $1,500 up front. Another $300 was meant to be paid by the Alcotts over a 2-year period. They all moved to the farm in June and named it Fruitlands, despite having only 10 apple trees on the property. The commune attracted 14 residents, if you count the Alcotts and the Lanes. They sought to achieve freedom by separating entirely from the world economy. They wanted to grow all their own food and keep to a strict vegetarian diet. Even some vegetables, including carrots, beets, and potatoes, were forbidden because they showed their baser nature by growing downwards. However, only one member had ever farmed before. Bronson's daughter, Louisa May Alcott, was 11 at the time. As she later said in her satirical essay, Transcendental Wild Oats, quote, The band of brothers began by spading garden and field, but a few days of it lessened their ardor amazingly." Unquote. Fruitlands failed in the first winter after it opened due to food shortages. I think I'll have a heart attack and die if I'm not surprised. Bronson lay for 3 days without moving, eating, or speaking. Charles Lane bitterly parted company and went with his son to join the Shakers. Lane blamed the failure on Bronson, who had misled him with his optimism. He also complained that Bronson had refused to renounce his marriage. I mean, what's the use of a hippie commune without free love? You may feel I've been a little hard on Bronson for the sake of a better story, and you'd be right. I have fondness and respect for this man, and the virtues of his educational philosophy are evident in the artistic successes of his daughters, May and Louisa May. Bronson met his wife, Abby May, through her brother Samuel, a Boston-based Unitarian minister from a wealthy family. Sam and Abby were both enthusiastic about Bronson's teaching methods. When Bronson moved from Connecticut to Boston, Abby became his assistant, and then his wife. Her parents were dismayed. For some reason, they didn't think Bronson could hold a job. Abby and a young family that eventually grew to 4 girls followed Bronson from job to job: Boston, Germantown, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and back to Boston. She said, "We hardly earn the bread," as she wrote to her brother, "and the butter we have to think about." She followed Bronson into exile at Concord and off to the disaster at Fruitlands and back to Concord, standing by her man. Just before the move to Fruitlands, Bronson got fired up by Charles Lane's anti-slavery views and said he would not support a corrupt government. He refused to pay his $1.50 poll tax to the town of Concord on the grounds that the USA was about to annex Texas as a slave state and nobody in the town government was doing anything about it. Abby wrote in her journal, "A day of some excitement, as Mr. Alcott refused to pay his town tax. After waiting some time to be committed, that's jailed, he was told it was paid by a friend. Thus we were spared the affliction of his absence and the triumph of suffering for his principles." She was a subtle woman. I can never tell when she's being sarcastic. A couple of years after Fruitlands, Abby got an inheritance, and the financial pressure was off for a while. At age 48, Abby May Alcott finally threw a fit. Some might think it was menopause. Me, I just think it was a long time coming. She called Concord cold, heartless, brainless, and soulless. The family, with 4 girls aged 8 to 17, moved to Boston. Abby came into her own as one of the state's first paid social workers. She also supported what some have called the Unitarian Holy Trinity: suffrage, abolition, and temperance. Concord's really not so bad, you know. The family returned there in 1857 to be near their transcendentalist friends like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Ellery Channing. And Bronson got some vindication as superintendent of Concord schools. According to his second daughter, author Louisa May Alcott, Abby, quote, always did what came to her in the way of duty and charity, and let pride, taste, and comfort suffer for love's sake, unquote. Louisa May Alcott was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and of course moved frequently as her father Bronson tried to find a living. She was the second of 4 daughters in the Alcott family, which means she cast herself as Jo in her famous novel Little Women. The book is not quite autobiographical. It's set in the Civil War, so the characters are 15 years younger than Louisa and her real sisters. But much of it is real, including the death of the third sister, who was named Beth in both life and the book. At age 8, Louisa briefly went to a school run by Henry David Thoreau. The school closed after the tragic death by a lockjaw of Henry's brother and partner. Louisa liked Concord and lived there as an adult, even though she wrote, "Poor, dull Concord. Nothing colorful has come through here since the Redcoats." Jo, the fictional version of Louisa, got married and had 2 sequels, but Louisa never married. She was uncomfortable with fame and sometimes sent fans away by pretending to be the maid. She died in Boston at age 56, just 2 days after her father, and she's buried at the family plot on Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, Concord. Louisa May Alcott's youngest sister, born in Concord, was just called Baby for years. Then she was named for her mother, Abby as a child, and May as an adult. Louisa paid for an education abroad, and May became a painter. She died in childbirth. Louisa raised her daughter Lulu until Louisa's own death. May has a memorial stone at the family plot in Sleepy Hollow, but she is actually buried in Paris.